I was on the dream honeymoon of a lifetime until I discovered a hidden drive that revealed my husband was actually a high-level operative in an organized scheme. Now the state is coming for me with a heavy legal accusation, and I realize the man I married never intended for me to make it home alive. The sand in Bali was supposed to be the backdrop for the best 2 weeks of my life. Mark and I had been married for exactly 48 hours, and as we walked along the shoreline of a secluded beach at sunset, the world felt perfect. We were young, we were in love, and our bank account was just healthy enough to sustain the delusion that nothing could ever go wrong. That was until we stumbled upon the market in the heart of the local village. It wasn't on the tourist map. It was tucked away behind a row of crumbling limestone structures, smelling of jasmine, damp earth, and something metallic that I couldn't quite place. Mark wanted to buy a wooden souvenir, but I found myself pulled toward a small, velvet-draped tent at the very edge of the alley. The woman sitting inside was ancient. Her skin was a map of deep, sun-baked wrinkles, and her eyes, clouded with cataracts, seemed to see right through my wedding ring and into the marrow of my bones. I didn't even want a reading, but she reached out, grabbing my wrist with a grip that felt like iron bands. She didn't offer a tarot card or a crystal ball. She simply whispered, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "The man you promised your life to is not the man whose shadow follows him. Before the moon wanes, the blood of an innocent will be on your hands, and the state will come to demand a debt you cannot pay." I laughed it off, of course. I pulled my hand away, feeling a jolt of static electricity that made my hair stand on end. I told Mark the old woman was just trying to scare tourists to drum up business. He just squeezed my hand, his knuckles turning white, and told me to forget it. But that night, as we checked into our luxury villa, the air turned frigid. Mark went to the safe to lock away our passports, and as he turned his back, a small, unmarked envelope fell from the lining of his leather jacket. A jacket he had supposedly bought brand new at the airport. Inside the envelope were blurry photographs of me. Not just photos of me in Bali, but photos of me at my desk at work, at my gym, and walking my dog back home, taken weeks before we'd even booked this trip. I sat on the edge of the plush, king-sized bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Mark was in the bathroom, the shower running, masking the sound of my ragged breathing. I looked at the photos again. They weren't professional surveillance shots. They were intimate, taken from angles that suggested someone had been living in my crawl space. As I flipped through them, my thumb brushed against something hard and rectangular hidden behind the last photo. It was a digital thumb drive, taped to the back of a picture of me sleeping. Curiosity overwhelmed my fear. I pulled my laptop from my tote bag and plugged the drive in. There was only one file, titled Project Django. I clicked it, expecting a video or a manifesto, but instead, my screen was flooded with bank statements, encrypted communication logs, and grainy footage of Mark meeting with a group of men in a dark parking garage back home. One of the men was handing him a heavy, locked briefcase, and Mark was nodding, his expression devoid of the warmth he showed me. Then, the footage changed. It showed Mark taking that same briefcase to a storage unit. He opened it, and I gasped. It wasn't money. It was stacks of sealed packets with forbidden substances, and nestled beneath them, cold and ominous, was illegal hardware wrapped in oiled rags. My stomach dropped. The fortune teller's words echoed in my mind. "The man you promised your life to is not the man whose shadow follows him." I realized then that this entire honeymoon wasn't a romantic getaway. It was an extraction. We weren't here to celebrate a union. We were here to relocate a life. I looked up at the door, my eyes wide with terror, just as the sound of the shower cut off. The sudden silence in the villa was deafening. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely pull the thumb drive from the port. Just as I reached for the lid of my laptop to slam it shut, the bathroom door creaked open. Mark walked out, wrapped in a white towel, his hair dripping water onto the floor. He stopped mid-step, his eyes locking onto my face, then darting down to the glowing screen of my laptop. He didn't look like my husband anymore. The softness was gone, replaced by a chilling, calculated stillness. He didn't ask what I was doing. He didn't reach for a towel. He slowly walked toward me, his hand reaching into his luggage bag, his fingers closing around something that definitely wasn't a toiletry kit. "You were always too curious for your own good, Sarah," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing every ounce of the affection I had grown to adore. "I told them you wouldn't notice until it was too late. I told them you were the perfect cover." I scrambled backward, hitting the headboard, my mind racing. I was trapped in a foreign country, thousands of miles from help, with a man who was clearly involved in an organized scheme far beyond my comprehension. Suddenly, there was a heavy, rhythmic thudding at the front door. Someone was knocking, or rather kicking, with force. "Open up! Service of a search warrant!" a voice boomed from the hallway. Mark's face paled, his composure shattering instantly. He looked at the window, then back at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. He grabbed my arm, his grip bruising, and leaned close, his breath smelling like copper. "If you breathe one word about what's on that drive," he hissed, "they won't just take me in for the illegal goods. They'll find out who you really are, and they'll bury us both under a mountain of heavy charges that will keep us behind bars until we're dust." Before I could scream, the villa door exploded inward, and men in tactical gear swarmed the room, shouting orders and pointing weapons. Mark shoved me toward them, throwing his hands up in a desperate display of innocence, his voice cracking as he pointed directly at my laptop. "She has it! She's the one you're looking for! She's the handler!" The world turned into a blurred chaos of shouting voices and the harsh, blinding glare of tactical flashlights. Before I could process Mark's betrayal, 2 officers in black gear had me pinned against the floor, their knees digging into my back. My face was pressed against the cold, polished tile of the villa, the smell of floor wax and terror filling my nostrils. Above the roar of the commotion, I heard the sound of my laptop being confiscated and the distinct click of a digital evidence seal. "Get her up," a deep, gravelly voice commanded. It wasn't the local police. These men moved with a level of cold efficiency that spoke of a federal operation. They hauled me to my feet, my wrists stinging as plastic restraints cinched tight around them. I looked over at Mark. He was on his knees, his hands behind his head, playing the role of the terrified, clueless groom to perfection. He was weeping. He actually had tears streaming down his face, a masterclass in manipulation that made my skin crawl. "I didn't know," he sobbed to the lead officer, pointing his shackled hands toward me. "She told me we were here for a yoga retreat. She told me she worked in finance, but she was always getting these encrypted messages. I thought it was just her job." "Shut it," the lead officer growled, but he didn't stop looking at me. He stepped into my personal space, his eyes scanning my face with a terrifying intensity. He was searching for a flicker of guilt, a sign of a hardened operative. But all he saw was a woman who had just realized her entire identity was a lie, constructed by the man she had sworn to love. "We have the device," another officer said, holding up my laptop. "It's got the whole network mapped out, and there's an encrypted file labeled Project Zero. It's the smoking gun we've been tracking for 3 years. My stomach turned. They were treating me like the architect of this entire criminal web. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to tell them the truth, to reveal that Mark was the one who had brought that drive, that he was the one who had been communicating with that organized scheme. But then I remembered his threat. "They'll find out who you really are." He had hinted that I was a target, not just because of him, but because of some ghost in my own past I didn't even remember. The officers dragged us out of the villa and into the humid Bali night. The street was lined with black vans, and the locals were peering from their windows, terrified and silent. We were shoved into the back of a van, sitting on a cold metal bench facing each other. Mark's act vanished the moment the heavy doors slammed shut. plunging us into darkness. He leaned forward, his face inches from mine, and the smile that spread across his lips was the most frightening thing I had ever seen. "You're the fall girl, Sarah," he whispered, his voice smooth and devoid of the sobbing hysteria he'd used seconds ago. "Do you think a mid-level analyst like you stands a chance against a professional network like ours? I have people in the internal security department who will make sure your testimony is shredded. You have the files. You have the motive. You have the access." "Why?" I choked out, my voice trembling. "Why would you marry me if you were just going to destroy me?" "Because you were clean," he replied, leaning back as the van started to move. "Your record was spotless, no red flags, perfect for moving the packages, perfect for taking the heat. The fortune teller was right about one thing. The man you married is a stranger. But you're wrong about the rest. You aren't going to be a victim, sweetheart. You're going to be a collaborator." I felt the van hit a bump, and for a split second, I saw a flicker of light through the rear doors. We were heading toward the airport, but not toward the international terminal. We were heading toward the harbor. I knew what this meant. If we left the country in custody of these officers, I would never see a lawyer. I would be taken to a black site, a place where no one would ever hear my screams again. Suddenly, the van swerved violently. A loud, metallic screech tore through the air, followed by the sound of tires blowing out. The van skidded across the road, slamming into a stone wall with a bone-jarring impact. I was thrown forward, my head striking the metal partition. For a moment, everything went black. When I regained consciousness, the back door of the van had been ripped off its hinges. The air was thick with smoke, and I could hear gunfire echoing in the distance. The men who had arrested us were gone, either dead or engaged in a firefight outside. I struggled to stand, my restraints still locked tight. Mark was gone too, having vanished into the chaotic darkness of the jungle. I crawled toward the edge of the wreckage, my head spinning. I needed to get away, to find a phone, to find someone, anyone who would listen to my story. But as I stumbled out onto the gravel road, I saw a figure standing in the shadows of the palm trees, watching me. It was the old fortune teller from the market. She was holding a small silver key and a burner phone. She walked toward me, her pace slow and deliberate. She didn't look surprised. She looked exhausted. She stopped in front of me and held out the phone. It started ringing the moment my fingers brushed it. I hesitated, then pressed it to my ear. "If you want to live," a cold, unrecognizable voice whispered from the other end, "run. Mark isn't the one who set you up. You have no idea who your real father was, do you?" Before I could answer, a black sedan tore around the corner, its headlights blinding me, and a man leaned out the window, pointing a weapon directly at my chest. I froze, the phone still pressed to my ear, realizing with a jolt of pure horror that the group chasing me wasn't the police at all. They were the ones who had paid Mark to frame me, and they were here to finish the job. The barrel of the weapon held by the man in the sedan was steady, reflecting the moonlight like a sliver of polished ice. My lungs burned as I scrambled backward, the gravel biting into my palms, but my legs felt like lead. The fortune teller didn't flinch. She simply stepped between me and the encroaching vehicle, her thin, frail frame acting as an impossible shield. She muttered something in a local dialect that sounded like a curse, and the sedan swerved violently, as if hit by an invisible force, slamming into the twisted metal of the overturned police transport. The screech of tearing steel was deafening, followed by a hiss of escaping steam. The driver of the sedan lay slumped against the steering wheel, but the passenger door flew open. A man stepped out, tall, wearing a sharp, tailored suit that looked entirely out of place in the humid Balinese jungle. He didn't look like a member of a street-level organized scheme. He looked like an executive, the kind of man who decides the fate of nations over dry martinis. He ignored the wreckage, his gaze locked onto me with a mixture of curiosity and clinical disdain. "You have your mother's eyes, Sarah," he said, his voice as smooth as polished glass. It's a shame you inherited her penchant for curiosity, too. It's exactly why she had to be removed from the equation 20 years ago. I gripped the burner phone until my knuckles turned white. "Who are you?" I screamed, my voice cracking under the weight of the adrenaline. "What do you want with me?" The man didn't answer. He turned his attention to the fortune teller, who was now standing perfectly still, her eyes glowing with a faint, unnatural luminescence in the darkness. "The bargain was that you would stay in the shadows, grandmother," the man said. "Interfering in a state-sanctioned extraction is a violation of your terms." Grandmother? My mind reeled. The woman I had dismissed as a scam artist in the village market was tied to the very people trying to kill me. She turned to look at me, her expression not one of warmth, but of grim, calculated urgency. "Run, child," she commanded, pressing a small, heavy object into my hand, a brass key with a seal I didn't recognize. The file on that drive wasn't just a list of crimes. It was a map. Go to the port. Seek the boat named the Obsidian. If you stay here, you become a victim of a very real attempt to break your life with a heavy legal accusation. "I'm not going anywhere without answers," I shouted. "Answers are for the living," she hissed. "And you have seconds before the real sweep begins." As if on cue, the distant sound of sirens, this time real, high-pitched, official sirens, began to wail through the jungle canopy. Not the tactical team that had raided the villa, but the local authorities. The man in the suit glanced at his watch, then back at me. He didn't seem concerned by the police. He seemed irritated. He pulled a small, metallic device from his pocket, and the air around us seemed to hum with a low-frequency vibration that made my teeth ache. "We don't have time for a family reunion," he sighed. He gestured, and two shadows emerged from the dense foliage behind him. They weren't wearing masks. They were wearing professional attire, carrying equipment that looked like high-end recording gear mixed with tactical gear. The fortune teller spun around, her hands moving in a blur, and a sudden, violent gust of wind whipped through the clearing, uprooting palm fronds and throwing dust into the eyes of the approaching men. I took my chance. I bolted. I didn't look back at the wreckage, or the man who claimed to know my mother. I sprinted into the dark, tangled undergrowth, the key burning a hole in my pocket. The jungle was a nightmare of sharp vines and uneven earth. I could hear them behind me, the systematic sweep of flashlights and the crunch of heavy boots. I didn't know the trail, but I followed the scent of salt air. I ran until my lungs felt like they were filled with broken glass. I finally stumbled onto a wooden pier, the moonlight reflecting off the black, churning water of the harbor. There, bobbing gently against the rotting pilings, was a sleek, black motorboat. The Obsidian was painted in fading gold letters on the hull. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was this my salvation, or another trap? I scrambled down the ladder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I jumped onto the deck and shoved the brass key into the ignition panel. It fit perfectly. The engine purred to life with a quiet, sophisticated hum that was far more advanced than anything I had seen on the island. I slammed the throttle forward, and the boat shot out into the open water, leaving the lights of the pier behind. I felt a momentary rush of relief, until I noticed something on the passenger seat. It was a laptop. My laptop. The one the tactical team had confiscated. It was open, the screen glowing. A video file was playing, muted. It showed Mark, sitting in a room I didn't recognize, talking to a camera. He looked calm, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression one of cold, professional detachment. He spoke, and though I couldn't hear him, the subtitles at the bottom of the screen made my blood run cold. "If you're watching this, Sarah, you've survived the first phase. But you should know, the people chasing you aren't the ones in control. I was never working for them. I was working for the Internal Security Division, and they've just issued a warrant for your arrest on a charge of a life-shattering nature. You're being framed as the mastermind of a global network. And by the way, check the fuel compartment." My heart stopped. I reached for the latch to the compartment under the deck, my hands trembling violently. I lifted the lid, and there, bathed in the blue light of the cabin, were not just tools, but hundreds of small, vacuum-sealed bags filled with a dark, crystalline substance. My boat was loaded with enough restricted goods to ensure I would never see the light of day again. Suddenly, a massive, blinding spotlight hit the back of my boat from the sky. A helicopter hovered overhead, its blades whipping the water into a frenzy, and a voice boomed from a loudspeaker, echoing across the bay. "Unidentified vessel, cut your engines and prepare to be boarded. This is a federal interception." I looked at the fuel gauge. It was dropping rapidly. I wasn't just being hunted, I was being herded. And then, from the bow of the boat, a phone taped to the windshield started to ring. I answered it, my hands shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. "Hello, daughter," the voice from the other end said. It wasn't the man in the suit, it was a woman's voice. A voice I hadn't heard since I was 5 years old. A voice I thought had been dead for 2 decades. "The boat is rigged to sink in 3 minutes. Do you want to know who I really am? Or do you want to start swimming?" "Mom?" I gasped, the word feeling like a foreign object in my throat. The wind from the helicopter's rotors was deafening, whipping my hair across my face, stinging my eyes. "How can you be here? You died, we buried you." "Death is a matter of perspective, Sarah." My mother's voice crackled, eerily calm despite the chaos surrounding me. "And right now, your perspective is narrow. You have 2 minutes before that vessel becomes a tomb. Jump overboard. Swim toward the red buoy 300 yards to your port side. If you hesitate, the internal security team on that chopper will turn this boat, and you along with it, into a firework. Do not look back. Do not try to clear your name through legal channels. Those channels were built to funnel you into a cell." The line went dead. I looked at the fuel gauge. It was plummeting toward 0. The engine sputtered, then choked, a cloud of thick, black smoke billowing from the stern. The helicopter spotlight turned into a searing white laser, pinning me to the deck. I could see the silhouette of a sniper leaning out of the side door, the red dot of a laser sight dancing across the bags of illegal substances piled in the fuel compartment. They weren't planning to arrest me. They were planning to eliminate the evidence. And I was the primary component of that evidence. I didn't think, I moved. I kicked my shoes off, vaulted over the side, and hit the black water with a jarring impact. The cold was instantaneous, sucking the breath from my lungs. As I surfaced, gasping for air, the boat exploded. The shock wave hit me like a physical blow, tossing me through the water as a wall of fire roared into the night sky. The heat was so intense it singed the skin on my back. I dove deep, swimming with every ounce of strength I had, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I could hear the muffled thrum of the helicopter circling the inferno, searching the water for a body. I swam until my lungs were screaming, guided only by the distant, rhythmic blinking of the red buoy. When I finally broke the surface near the buoy, I was shaking uncontrollably, my muscles burning with lactic acid. I clung to the barnacle-covered metal, gasping for oxygen. A small, silent shadow emerged from the darkness of the nearby cove, a low-profile skiff with its lights doused. It pulled alongside the buoy, and a hand reached out, grabbing my hair and yanking me aboard with brutal force. I collapsed onto the deck, coughing up seawater, staring up at my rescuer. It wasn't my mother. It was the man from the suit, the one who had claimed I had my mother's eyes. He stood over me, his expression unreadable, his tailored coat now soaked and ruined. He handed me a towel, but he didn't offer a hand to help me up. "You swim well," he remarked, his tone detached. "It's a pity. You could have been an asset. Instead, you're a liability." "Who are you?" I demanded, shivering so hard my teeth chattered. "What do you want from me?" "I am the man who manages the assets your mother walked away from," he said, checking his watch. "She stole a fortune in proprietary data and vanished into the ether. We've been tracking her through every accident and disappearance for 20 years. You weren't a target because of your marriage, Sarah. You were the bait. We knew she couldn't stay away if you were in real trouble. My brain struggled to process the revelation. The wedding, the move to Bali, the fortune teller, the setup. It was all a trap designed to draw my mother out of hiding. "Where is she?" I whispered. "She's currently watching us through a thermal scope from the ridge above," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the looming, jagged cliffs. "And she's holding a detonator that can trigger a local seismic collapse. She's threatened to bury this entire harbor if we don't release you." I looked toward the dark cliffs, feeling a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the ocean. "Mom, don't," I whispered to the night air. "She won't hear you," the man said, pulling a weapon from his waistband and clicking the safety off. "But she will see this." He pointed the weapon toward the horizon, and suddenly, the sky above the cliffs erupted in a flash of brilliant, artificial light. A flare, but one that burned with a strange, violet hue. My phone, which had miraculously survived in my waterproof pocket, buzzed with a single text message from an unknown number. "Look at the bottom of the buoy, Sarah. The key wasn't for the boat. It was for the man." I looked at the man standing over me. His posture shifted, his eyes darting toward the shore. He seemed to be listening to an earpiece I hadn't noticed before. He suddenly looked panicked, his fingers trembling as he reached for a device on his belt. "The frequency," he muttered. "She's jamming the internal security channel." In that moment of hesitation, I realized the brass key in my pocket wasn't a physical key at all. It was a magnetic override. I lunged forward, pressing the key against the side of his belt-mounted device. A spark jumped between the two, a high-pitched whine filled the air, and the man dropped his weapon, clutching his head in agony as the device short-circuited. I scrambled up, grabbing his fallen weapon, my hands finally steady. I pointed it at him, but he just laughed, his eyes rolling back as the surge of electricity overwhelmed him. "You think you're in control?" he choked out, collapsing to his knees. "Your mother isn't trying to save you, Sarah. She's trying to finish the job you were brought here to do. Check the internal logs of the boat you just destroyed. You didn't just carry a shipment of prohibited items. You carried a bioweapon, and it's already been released into the harbor's water supply." I froze. A sudden, terrifying realization washed over me. The sickness, the metallic smell, the urgency of the fortune teller. It wasn't about criminal goods. It was about an infection. I looked at my hands, and to my horror, I saw faint, glowing veins pulsing under the skin of my wrists, a sickly, bioluminescent blue that was spreading rapidly toward my heart. The blue light under my skin wasn't just a mark. It was a countdown. Every heartbeat sent a jolt of ice-cold electricity through my veins, and as I watched the glow crawl toward my chest, I realized the terrifying truth of the bioweapon. It wasn't intended to kill the masses. It was a catalyst, a synthetic tether designed to bind me to the very network that had tried to erase me. I was the key, the living hardware. The man in the suit slumped to the deck, his breathing shallow, his face a mask of agony, as the feedback from his own device crippled him. I didn't wait for him to recover. I kicked the weapon away and dove back into the water, ignoring the burning in my chest. I had to find the source. If I was the tether, I had to break the connection. I swam toward the cliffs, the water around me shimmering with that unnatural bioluminescent pulse. As I reached the shoreline, the beach was deserted, save for a single figure standing near a cave entrance that opened into the limestone rock. It was my mother. She looked exactly as she had in my childhood memories, preserved in a state of ageless, frozen time. She wasn't just hiding. She was guarding something. "You're running out of time, Sarah," she said, her voice echoing off the stone walls. She didn't move as I approached, her eyes fixed on the cave. "The synchronization is almost complete. Once it hits your heart, you will be the ultimate archive. You will remember every file, every illicit transaction, every secret they've ever tried to bury, and you will be theirs forever. You did this, I accused, my voice shaking as the blue light reached the center of my chest. You weren't hiding from them, you were waiting for the next version of yourself to be ready. I was waiting for a successor who could survive the transition, she corrected, her face devoid of any maternal warmth. But I never expected you to have the drive to fight back. That's your father's defiance. It's inconvenient. She raised her hand, and I felt my muscles lock, my entire body obeying a command I couldn't understand. She was the administrator. She was the one who had built this organized scheme from the ground up, using my own life as the foundation. I realized then that there was no good side. The internal security department, the criminal network, the fortune teller, they were all different branches of the same rotting tree. I'm not a file, I growled, fighting the paralysis. The blue light in my veins spiked, reacting to my rage. I remembered the brass key. I didn't use it on a lock. I jammed it into the port behind my own ear, a small, barely noticeable bump I'd had since birth, which I had always assumed was a scar. The moment the key touched the point, a surge of raw, unadulterated static filled my brain. The world shattered. The beach, the cave, my mother's cold expression, they flickered like a dying light bulb. I wasn't in a jungle. I was in a room, a sterile, white room filled with monitors. I saw my own reflection in the glass wall. I was strapped into a chair, tubes connected to my arms, my body trembling as the simulation of the honeymoon played out on a massive screen before me. Mark was there, not as my husband, but as a technician, his face pale and sweating as he monitored the readouts. "She's breaking the sync," he shouted to someone off camera. "The emotional feedback is too high. We're losing the data." I ripped the electrodes from my temples, the simulated world of the beach finally dissolving into jagged pixels. I kicked the chair back, sending it crashing into the primary server rack. Sparks showered the room, and the hum of the cooling fans died out. The silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. I stood up, my legs weak, and walked over to the glass wall. Through the pane, I saw not a lush Balinese village, but a gray, industrial facility buried deep underground. Dozens of people were running in a panic, their screens going black as I deleted the entire architecture of their lives with one final command. The override code I had subconsciously held in my mind since the fortune teller had first triggered the sequence. Mark approached me, his hand raised, but he stopped when he saw the look in my eyes. I wasn't the terrified bride anymore. I was the one who had seen behind the curtain, and I knew how to burn the stage down. "The charges," Mark stammered, his bravado gone. "They're going to pin everything on you. The illegal substances, the threats. The system is already uploading the files to the public record. You can't stop it." "I don't need to stop it," I said, pointing to the wall of monitors, now flickering with real-time footage of the police and the press swarming the facility's front gates. I just opened the doors. The security forces burst through the heavy steel bulkhead, not for me, but for the corruption that had built this prison. In the chaos, I walked out of the facility and into the cool morning air. I didn't look back at Mark, or the facility, or the screen that had held my life hostage. I walked until I reached the main road where a taxi was waiting. I had no money, no identity, and a past that had been digitally erased. But for the first time in my life, the road ahead was completely empty. I wasn't a file, an asset, or a victim. I was finally, irrevocably, human. I told the driver to take me to the airport. I didn't care where the plane was going, as long as it wasn't back to the life I had escaped. As the sun rose over the horizon, the last flicker of blue light under my skin vanished, and I closed my eyes, ready to start a story that finally belonged to me.